For years, this stretch of ocean off South Africa wasn't just famous, it was legendary. False Bay was one of the few places on Earth where great white sharks didn't stay hidden or mysterious. They were present, visible, and dominant. Tour boats headed out almost every morning with cameras ready, because sightings weren't rare or based on luck. This was one of the best places in the world to watch great white sharks breach the surface, launching their massive bodies out of the water as they hunted seals near the shoreline. Scientists focused on False Bay because the sharks here were reliable. They returned season after season, followed familiar routes, and behaved in ways researchers could actually study. Entire tourism industries were built around that predictability. Locals grew up knowing these sharks were part of the bay's identity. Dangerous, yes, but stable and expected. As apex predators, great whites shaped everything around them. Seals stayed alert and cautious. Other predators avoided areas where sharks were active. The ecosystem had a balance, and the great white sat firmly at the top of it. Then something strange began to happen. Tour boats started coming back empty. Days passed without a single sighting, then weeks, and eventually months. Operators stopped guaranteeing shark encounters. Researchers questioned whether their tracking equipment was failing. On the surface, the ocean looked unchanged, but one of its most powerful residents was no longer there. The great white sharks of False Bay hadn't slowly declined, and they hadn't clearly migrated to another nearby hotspot. They were simply gone. At first, no one panicked. Great white sharks are known to move. They follow food, water temperatures, and seasonal patterns, so a quiet day or even a quiet week didn't seem alarming. Operators assumed the sharks had shifted slightly out of the bay, and researchers expected them to show up again the way they always had. But they didn't. By the time months had passed, the absence was impossible to ignore. False Bay, once one of the most reliable great white hotspots in the world, had become strangely empty. Shark cages were lowered into the water with nothing circling them. Tracking data showed fewer and fewer signals returning to the area. Eventually, many of the tagged sharks simply stopped appearing in the bay altogether. What made this more unsettling was how sudden it felt. There was no long, gradual decline in sightings. One season they were there, behaving normally, and shortly after, they were almost completely gone. For a species known for consistency in key habitats, this kind of disappearance didn't fit the usual patterns. Researchers began comparing notes across years and locations, trying to figure out whether the sharks had shifted to a nearby region or if something had actively pushed them away. Nearby coastal areas were checked. Known migration routes were monitored. The numbers still didn't add up. Even the seals seemed confused. Colonies that once hugged the shoreline and stayed close to escape routes began changing their behavior. With fewer sharks around, they ventured farther into open water and spent more time swimming freely, something they rarely did when great whites were actively hunting. Whatever had happened, it wasn't subtle. False Bay hadn't just lost a few sharks. It had lost its apex predator, and the ocean doesn't lose something like that without a reason. When great white sharks disappeared from False Bay, the change wasn't limited to scientists and tour operators. The entire ecosystem began to behave differently, and it didn't take long for those changes to become noticeable. Seals were the first to give it away. In a bay dominated by great whites, seals usually move with caution. They stick close to the shoreline, keep their dives short, and stay alert for sudden attacks from below. After the sharks vanished, that caution started to fade. Seals began swimming farther from land, diving longer, and spreading out into areas they once avoided entirely. To researchers, this was a clear signal. Apex predators don't just hunt individual animals, they control behavior. Even when they aren't actively killing prey, their presence shapes how other species move, feed, and survive. Without great whites enforcing that pressure, the balance began to shift. Other changes followed. Smaller predators that once avoided shark-heavy areas became more active. Fish distributions adjusted. The bay didn't collapse, but it clearly wasn't functioning the way it had before. Removing a top predator doesn't create instant chaos, but it does start a chain reaction that quietly reshapes the system over time. What made this especially unsettling was that the ocean hadn't replaced the great white with anything obvious. There was no gradual takeover by another shark species, no slow transition that explained the shift. One of the most powerful animals in the ecosystem had stepped away, and the space it left behind felt unusually empty. For scientists, this raised a more troubling question. Great white sharks don't abandon prime habitat without pressure. Something had changed in False Bay, and whatever it was strong enough to push an apex predator out of territory it had controlled for decades. While researchers were still trying to understand why great white sharks had left False Bay, a different pattern began to emerge in the background. It didn't come from missing data or empty tracking maps. It came from something far more direct: orcas. These black and white predators had been seen along the South African coastline before, but only occasionally and usually in passing. Then, sightings became more frequent. Soon after, the first unusual carcasses started washing up on shore. Great white sharks. Their bodies showed a very specific kind of damage. The liver had been removed with remarkable precision, while the rest of the shark was often left untouched. To scientists familiar with orca hunting behavior, this was a clear signature. Orcas are highly intelligent, coordinated hunters, and shark livers are extremely rich in energy. For them, this was an efficient kill. What surprised researchers wasn't just that orcas could kill great white sharks, but how quickly the sharks responded. Instead of adapting or fighting back, great whites simply left. Tracking data showed sharks abandoning the area within days of orca appearances, sometimes fleeing hundreds of kilometers away. From the shark's perspective, this reaction makes sense. Great white sharks rely on stealth and ambush. Orcas hunt in groups, communicate, and learn from one another. In a direct confrontation, the great white loses its advantage. Rather than risk repeated encounters, the sharks chose avoidance. This revealed something important. The disappearance of great white sharks from False Bay wasn't necessarily caused by a slow environmental decline. It may have been triggered by fear. For the first time in decades, the apex predator of the bay had found itself outmatched. As convincing as the orca explanation seemed, scientists were careful not to settle on a single cause too quickly. Ecosystems are rarely changed by one factor alone, especially when the shift is this dramatic. Orcas may have delivered the final push, but other pressures were already building. Overfishing along the South African coast has reduced the availability of key prey species, not just for sharks, but for the entire marine food web. Fewer fish mean less stable feeding grounds, making once reliable habitats less attractive over time. On top of that, commercial fishing activity increases the risk of accidental shark capture and human disturbance in areas great whites once used freely. There's also the issue of human presence. Boat traffic, noise, and coastal development have steadily increased around False Bay. While great white sharks are adaptable, they are not indifferent to constant disruption. When combined with other stressors, even small changes can add up. Climate conditions may have played a supporting role as well. Shifts in water temperature and ocean currents can influence where prey gathers and how predators move. None of these factors alone fully explain the sudden disappearance, but together they help explain why the sharks may have been more willing to abandon the area once a serious threat appeared. In other words, orcas may not be the only reason great whites left False Bay, but they might have been the tipping point. When an ecosystem is already under pressure, it doesn't take much to trigger a major change. What makes this situation especially important is that it shows how fragile dominance at the top of the food chain can be. Even apex predators respond to risk, and when the cost of staying becomes too high, they move on. So far, the great white sharks of False Bay have not returned in the numbers they once did. There have been occasional sightings along the coast, but the predictable seasonal presence that made this area famous is still missing. Some researchers believe the sharks could come back if the pressure eases. Orcas don't stay in one place forever, and if their visits become less frequent, great whites may slowly reclaim the bay. Others are less certain. Once sharks establish new hunting routes elsewhere, there may be little reason to return to a place that no longer feels safe. What's clear is that False Bay has already changed. The disappearance of its apex predator reshaped the ecosystem, proving how quickly dominance in the ocean can shift, even for a species that once ruled these waters.